October is Domestic Violence Month, and it is estimated that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men are victims of abuse. Today, Fort Bragg hosted a symposium about preventing domestic violence, sexual harassment, and assault. WRAL's Gilbert Bays shares reaction to the event. Gilbert?
Well, Michelle, Major General K.K. Chin, the acting commander here at Fort Bragg, gave the opening remarks, and he said that domestic violence and sexual assault incidents, the #1 complaints that come across his desk every day. So that's why this symposium is so important, and hopefully it's going to give commanders the ability to identify the problem and also help them stop it.
And the military has done a very responsible and
Captain Jesse Sommer is an advocate for soldiers who have experienced domestic violence or sexual assault.
There are younger men who are offending against younger women in our ranks, partially because we haven't taught them how to recognize the signs of consent and what to do when consent is there or is not there.
Get after sexual assault.
One of the purposes of this domestic violence symposium is to make sure commanders are aware of the many programs available on post to help their soldiers and their families. And that's when commanders are saying that it is critical for them to identify the family elements of domestic violence, because right here on post there are more than a dozen programs designed not only to help the soldiers, Michelle, but also to help family members as well.
Gilbert Bays sharing some very important information about resources available. Gilbert Bays live at Fort Bragg. Thank you.
Our first speaker is actually he has a new job here on post and in the Army. He's a Special Victim Counsel. His name is Captain Jesse Sommer. And we're very pleased to have him today. He's going to be speaking about a variety of things and combining our messages. I won't go over his entire bio, but if you would look at it in your program, he has a very interesting, very skilled experience in his area. We're very pleased to have him. I hope you'll give Captain Sommer a very warm welcome.
Good morning. My name is Captain Sommer, and I'm a Special Victim Counsel at the 82nd Airborne Division. I provide legal representation to victims of rape and sexual assault of soldiers and defendants to ensure that their legal interests are paramount in military justice proceedings. This is a new position envisioned by Congress, and it's revolutionary. Historically, there was a defense counsel who represents the legal rights of an accused in accordance with basic constitutional principles, and there was a prosecutor, what the military calls a trial counsel, who represents the legal interests of the government, which seeks convictions against perpetrators for having the audacity to violate the government's laws. But in the last few years, there's been an emerging sense that victims should have their own attorney to advocate for their rights in this process. So, Congress formalized the position of Special Victim Counsel, because there's no problem you can't solve by throwing another lawyer at it. I want to thank the Family Advocacy Program for inviting me to speak at this initiative, one of many focused on eradicating sexual violence within the Army and American society at large. I also want to thank my former Staff Judge Advocate, Colonel John Ohlweiler, and my new leadership, Lieutenant Colonel Dean Whitford and Lieutenant Colonel Sue McConnell, for their guidance and the freedom they've given us to establish this position. The SVCs at Fort Bragg really are at the forefront of identifying the legal needs of victims and defining the Army's response. To that end, most credit is due Colonel Jay McKee, the inaugural Special Victim Counsel Program Manager, whose support, vision, and dedication has given victims of rape and sexual assault a stronger voice in military justice and a sense that they will not be overlooked nor disrespected. The caliber of military brass here today emphasizes how seriously the Army has taken and responded to allegations of sex crimes in its ranks. To give everyone a sense of the progress, when a victim reports a crime, he or she is immediately assigned a victim advocate, can consult with an on-post therapist, may be treated by a professional sexual assault nurse examiner, has the option of speaking with me, a private attorney who exists outside of command influence, is engaged by a specialized force of CID agents who investigate the allegations and will ultimately watch justice metered out by a trained special victim prosecutor. And those are just some of the resources. That so many victims have come forward to report their assailants is furthermore an indication that the Army's SHARP program is reaching soldiers who have been subjected to sexual trauma. Reporting rates have skyrocketed, and there is every indication to believe that this is because victims feel increasingly confident about reporting crimes and assisting the Army in eliminating dangerous elements within. As in so many cases throughout modern history, when it comes to social progress, the Army is leading the way. So, I can't speak to barracks life, but I'm told it ain't that different from campus life. On weekends in college over a decade ago, my boys and I would get a bunch of kegs and hard alcohol, and we'd orchestrate these dorm parties where, with the express purpose of getting everyone hammer-sloshed and loose. Those were the nights that being 5'8" and freakishly pale weren't such detriments on the dating scene. The point was to suppress inhibition and eliminate any sense of accountability. That's a modern description of weekends in college. That's also a description of sexual predation. This morning, I want to talk about a particular type of sexual assault. Articles that appeared in the papers just this past weekend remind us that sexual harassment, sex assault, and rape can be committed by service members in every branch, at every rank, by women, by offenders targeting the same sex, and with the object of either sexual gratification or humiliation of a victim. But what I want to talk about now are the sex crimes so disturbingly prevalent in American society that the young adults partying in the barracks, in the woods, the bars, by the lake, don't even recognize their behavior for what it is. I'm talking about sexual violence committed by our young male soldiers against their female counterparts. And as hard as this is to say, I'm talking about college students who'd liquor up an entire dorm complex to make it easier to get consent. Note that I said get consent. There are many factors that contribute to the type of nights that produce what become the special victim clients I represent. Yet while there's no question that alcohol often plays a role in hurt feelings, morning after regrets, or much worse, the primary explanation is culture and a misunderstanding of consent. You see, there are two types of consent. There's consent that you get, and there's consent that you're given. While society has acknowledged the imperative of consent, while it understands that no means no, a common theme in many cases is that accused soldiers think they'd assembled all the pieces necessary to get to yes. They just didn't appreciate what yes is supposed to signify. We are failing to teach our young men the imperative that consent be willingly given. Because just as there are two types of consent, there are probably two types of perpetrators. There are the sociopathological rapists who use sex to exert dominance over victims to feed their egos. And these individuals lack the capacity for empathy, and as I understand it, are incurable. The Army will continue to identify, prosecute, often convict, and remove these individuals from society. But then there are the young men who often are totally ignorant to the fact that their behavior legally constitutes rape and sexual assault on a given Friday night. Perhaps it shouldn't be so shocking that many young men are surprised when they're accused of rape. We've yet to celebrate the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, or the 10th anniversary of the military's criminalization of spousal rape, or the historic moment when we can call our Commander-in-Chief Madam President. We are a culture that's still just waking up from the haze of primitive traditions. For millennia, and even in some cultures today, the only laws against rape serve to reinforce a man's ownership over women, with eye for an eye penalties that actually sanctioned retributive rape as punishment. Sex assaults aren't just a law enforcement concern. They're also a cultural pathology. And you can't suppress culture. You can only try to change it. There's always going to be dudes trying to step to a girl. And we can't stop that. But we can teach men that there's a time and place for vocalizing their attraction in a manner that secures a woman's dignity, that doesn't jeopardize her sense of safety, that values her work in professional settings, that gives her agency in even the briefest of courtships. We must teach young men what language to utilize, the proper limits of persistence, and the ability to gauge the effect of their overtures. In short, we need to revive a code of chivalry without the paternalistic overtones. Check my Tinder game. I'd be happy to give lessons. Society's heart is in the right place. Across the country, colleges, state governments, and other trusted institutions are taking action. But I'm concerned about the proliferation of affirmative consent laws, of so-called yes means yes. I'm worried about the implications of these policies. When I brief younger soldiers around post on issues like this, I'm told of a technique wherein paramours suspend a hookup until the woman sends a text message to the man confirming that she does in fact consent to sexual activity. I actually even just read about this new mobile app that does something very similar. This is a problem for 3 reasons. First, it presents women as something of which to be afraid, as if she's just waiting to scream rape, but whew, got this text message, so safe. This is yet another social stigma we are cultivating. And what if the yes text convention is overlooked? Was there consent? Second, forgive me, but if you're so concerned about the need to create an evidentiary trail, you sure this is something you really want to do? We are setting ourselves up for failure if we rely on digital methods to prove consent rather than teaching our soldiers what consent looks like and why real consent requires no defensive text messages. Third, it'd be a tragedy if an affirmative consent text message sent after an evening of drinks actually carried legal weight in a court-martial. The whole concept of affirmative consent implies that consent is a point in time, rather than an ongoing, ever-changing spectrum of considerations, the constant reevaluation of which should be a part of any healthy sexual encounter. What does a text message saying, "I consent," actually consent to? The things that can happen during a sexual encounter are defined by the vast expanse of human imagination. So to which items in that nearly unlimited freak buffet are we consenting? I was asked this at a briefing. What if she's already consented and all of a sudden she says no? That's a disturbing question. But for us to dismiss it distances us from our responsibility to teach young men why a woman might suddenly change her mind and what to do if she does. Statistics suggest that there's a real possibility a woman has a history of sexual abuse in her past. Or maybe someone has second thoughts about an adulterous situation. Or maybe, through the fog of a couple drinks, a woman suddenly becomes cognizant to the implications of being known as the easy girl in the barracks. And now she'll be dealing with whispers and jokes and unwanted advances from dudes trying to get a piece. Most men don't deal with these pressures and are therefore oblivious to them. We need to educate men about these anxieties and experiences and teach them what to do and how to offer support if yes becomes no. Soldiers love to ask me, but what if she just gets upset and lies? Get a good attorney. As they say in the paratrooper community, if it's your time, it's your time. Yeah, I may be a rigger mispacked to shoot, but thanks to precautionary training, paratroopers know to grasp the ripcord handle, throw your head back into the rear, pull out the ripcord handle, drop it, and ride the reserve parachute into the ground. If our troops are worried about false reports, there are precautions they can take, and they include getting to know the person with whom they intend to be intimate and talking about it. Soldiers who use protection are less likely to end up with sexually transmitted infections. Soldiers who respect the basic human dignity of their partners are less likely to end up as sex-offending felons. Fact. So, why are we here? Why the focus on the prevention of sexual assault? To cultivate the most effective force necessary to win America's wars and protect our national interests, our first priority must be to protect the welfare and dignity of the soldiers who wage those wars. Here are a few ways we can do that. First, we must teach our young men and women how to talk to each other. In our sharp presentations and safety briefings, we hammer home the necessity of consent at the threat of criminal penalty. And one of the more effective lines is, are you willing to risk 20 years confinement on whether she really consented? But I'm telling you, these kids are confused about what consent even is. We need to teach young soldiers how to facilitate and engage in collaborative romance. We need to help men understand the psychological damage inflicted by catcalls, sexist jokes, and the myriad pressures and indignities that women daily endure as the remnants of history work their way out of our social legacy. Second, and similarly, we must recognize the pillars of a culture that accommodate and even normalize rape and sexual assault, and stamp out even seemingly innocuous comments and behaviors. We must refocus our energies towards identifying offenders and offensive behaviors instead of focusing on the victim's conduct. Those who suffer from psychopathy must be routed out, and those who just don't get it need to be educated so we can capitalize on the immense potential of all our soldiers, both male and female. I'm not proposing surrender to a mindless political correctness that threatens to fray the critical bonds formed to deal with the trauma of warfare. But the fastest way to reintroduce off-color jokes back into the Army is to make sure that all soldiers are in on that joke, that the critical bonds are shared by everyone. Third, and I am sorry to place responsibility on the women in this audience, but we need you to help us. I grew up in a house with 3 beautiful and talented, intelligent sisters, and a mother whose bedtime reading selections included excerpts from that month's edition of Ms. Magazine. And I still don't always get it. Help this Army understand your experience within it. Help us identify people and conduct that harm you. And help us understand how and why it does. I'm not routinely catcalled. My personal intimate space is not routinely violated. My value as a human being is not routinely trivialized by comments that society fails to recognize as demeaning. Only you can help me develop the capacity to empathize and participate in the Army's progress. I want to finish with a personal story. A few years ago, I took a mesmerizing young woman on a date and stunned even myself with my incredible charm and wit. At the end of the dinner, I naturally took the check and prepared to pay. She immediately stopped me, saying, "Please, I want to pay half." And I was like, "No." I'm thinking to myself, like, this is the last thing men have left, which itself is such a culturally revealing thought. And I'm like, I'm going to feel emasculated. I really want to do this. And she still refused. So I asked her what her problem was, and she just looked at me, and after a second said, "When men pay for dinner, they always develop expectations and get really aggressive. I've had a great time, and I just don't want to deal with it tonight." That's culture. That's how men behave when they try to get consent. For better or worse, sex will happen. Let's make it our job to ensure that the sex is safe and the sex is great. We should be teaching our men not how to get consent, but rather, why to wait for it. And we shouldn't be teaching men to await consent solely to avoid criminal penalty. We should teach them to await consent in recognition of their battle buddies' basic humanity. Because America needs the soldiers who fight its wars to feel safe side by side, both in formation and in bed. Thank you.